I stood there in the early morning light, fists clenched at my sides, watching the destruction unfold in real time. My cornfield, my livelihood, my family's legacy, was being torn apart beneath the oversized tires of a bright red Jeep Wrangler. Row after row of golden stalks, standing over 8 feet tall, snapped and folded under the vehicle's relentless path. The roar of the engine, the crunch of breaking stalks, it was like watching a wildfire rip through dry brush. Except this wasn't an accident. This was intentional. At the wheel sat Barbara Whitmore, president of the Maple Creek Estates HOA, wearing an expensive blue blazer embroidered with the HOA's logo. She maneuvered the Jeep like she was taking a victory lap, her expression unreadable behind oversized sunglasses. I could only stand there, stunned, as she drove straight through 3 acres of my best corn, crushing thousands of dollars of crops under her wheels before finally coming to a stop. The only reason she stopped at all was because she'd managed to get herself stuck in a low irrigation ditch, the front tires half sunken in the soft, damp earth. I stormed toward her, my boots sinking into the ruined soil, heat rising in my face. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" My voice was thick with barely contained rage. Barbara brushed a few stray corn silks off her pristine blazer, like she'd just walked through an overgrown garden rather than annihilated my harvest. Then, as if I were the one causing a problem, she sighed and removed her sunglasses. "I'm conducting an official HOA property line inspection," she said smoothly. "We've had complaints that your farmland is encroaching on community property, so I needed to verify for myself." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Encroaching on community property? My farm had been here for nearly 80 years, long before the first foundation was poured in Maple Creek Estates. This wasn't their land. It had never been their land. "You destroyed thousands of dollars of crops," I said, voice shaking. "That's called trespassing and criminal property damage. And you're going to pay for every cent of it." Barbara actually laughed. A short, condescending chuckle, like I was an overreacting child. "Oh, please. Don't be so dramatic," she said, waving a manicured hand. "It's just some corn. And frankly, your outdated farming operation has been negatively impacting our residents' quality of life for years." I decided it was time to address it. Luke, my grandson, came speeding up in his pickup, skidding to a stop next to me. He took one look at the flattened field and his face turned red with rage. "Are you kidding me?" he shouted. "There's a service road around the perimeter. You had no reason to be in this field." Barbara rolled her eyes, unimpressed by his anger. "I chose the most direct route." I was so furious my hands were shaking. "Barbara, this isn't your land, and it never will be. You had no right." She pulled a business card from her blazer pocket, extending it toward me like she was doing me a favor. The HOA logo gleamed in embossed gold. "Send any concerns to our legal department," she said coolly. Then she turned away mid-conversation and pulled out her phone. "Yeah, hi," she said into the receiver. "I need a tow. I'm on the edge of Harmon Farm, excuse me, Maple Creek Estate's eastern boundary." She shot me a smug glance. "Yes, it's quite muddy. Someone really should have posted warning signs." Luke swore under his breath. I clenched my jaw so hard it ached. By the time the tow truck arrived, Barbara had called in backup, 2 additional HOA board members, who stood with their arms crossed, glaring at me like I was the problem. When the Jeep was finally hauled out, its undercarriage scratched and muddied, Barbara turned to me one last time. "Oh, and just so you know," she said, brushing imaginary dust off her blazer, "I'll be sending you the bill for the towing. Your poorly maintained field damaged my vehicle." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over. 3 acres of prime corn, gone. $32,000 of income, erased in a single morning of entitled arrogance. The sheriff had come out, taken photos, filed a report, but called it a civil matter. My insurance adjuster estimated the damage at over $35,000, including the cost of soil remediation. And the next morning, as if Barbara hadn't already done enough damage, I found an envelope taped to my mailbox. It was an official notice from the Maple Creek Estates HOA. A $5,000 fine for unauthorized land modifications and unsightly conditions negatively impacting the neighborhood. Barbara hadn't just destroyed my crops, she was charging me for it. That $5,000 fine felt like a slap in the face, but I should have known Barbara wasn't done. People like her never stop at just one power move. The next week, I started noticing strange cars parked along my property line, their drivers stepping out, snapping photos, and muttering into their phones. At first, I thought maybe they were just curious neighbors, but when I saw one man in a suit crouching down to inspect my irrigation system, I knew something was off. "Can I help you?" I called out, striding toward him. The man looked startled but quickly recovered. "Oh, just conducting an environmental review." I narrowed my eyes. "By whose authority?" He hesitated just long enough for me to know he wasn't here on official business. "We've had some concerns raised about runoff pollution from your farm affecting Maple Creek Estates," he said, straightening his tie. "Fertilizer levels in local water sources, pesticide usage, just routine checks." Routine checks, my ass. This was Barbara's doing. I knew it before the words were even out of his mouth. 2 days later, I got an official letter from the city council, informing me of a hearing to discuss whether my farm should be declared a public nuisance due to environmental concerns. It was scheduled for next month, and if they ruled against me, they could enforce strict new farming restrictions, fines, or even force parts of my land to be rezoned for buffer use. In short, Barbara was trying to legally push me off my own land. I stormed into Walt Benson's office the next morning, tossing the letter onto his desk. "She's trying to bury me, Walt." He read the document, exhaling sharply. "This isn't just some HOA overreach. If they succeed, you could lose the right to farm certain sections of your property entirely." "What are my options?" I asked, fists clenched at my sides. "We fight it. We'll need proof that these environmental complaints are baseless, expert testimony, and documentation proving your farm has been operating within legal agricultural guidelines." I knew the accusations were nonsense. This land had been farmed for generations without issue, but fighting it meant more money, more stress, and more time away from the fields. And that was exactly what Barbara wanted. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, a county inspector showed up unannounced that same afternoon. "This another routine check?" I asked dryly as I watched the man unload a clipboard from his truck. He didn't look like he wanted to be here. "Multiple anonymous complaints," he said, clearing his throat. "Concerns about expired permits, outdated equipment, improper handling of chemicals." "Let me guess," I muttered, already knowing. "The HOA?" He didn't confirm it, but he didn't deny it either. I let him inspect whatever he needed, walking him through my completely up-to-date, fully compliant farming operations. When it was over, he shook his head. "Look, I'm not seeing anything here that warrants concern. Everything looks above board." "So this was a waste of both our time?" I asked. The inspector gave me an apologetic shrug. "I'll file my report, but if someone keeps making complaints, I have to keep coming back." And that was the game, wasn't it? Barbara didn't need real reasons to come after me, she just had to keep throwing enough dirt to slow me down, cost me money, and hope that eventually, I'd give up. Luke was fuming when I told him. "This is harassment, Grandpa. We should be going after her, not playing defense." I agreed, but we needed to be smart about this. "We have to be patient, Luke. She's trying to bait us into making a mistake. We have to play this the right way." And as it turned out, I wouldn't have to wait long for her mistake. Because when Luke suggested we start pulling our own legal records to get ahead of the fight, I stumbled onto something Barbara and the HOA never expected us to find. And it was going to change everything. Luke was right, we needed to fight back, but not blindly. If Barbara wanted to drown me in paperwork and legal fees, then I'd beat her at her own game. That's why, the next morning, we drove into town to visit the county records office, a place I hadn't stepped foot in since renewing the deed on my land a decade ago. The office was dimly lit, with rows of filing cabinets stretching from wall to wall, each drawer packed with yellow documents and fragile maps that smelled like ink and time. Luke and I combed through decades of property surveys, tax assessments, and deed transfers, looking for anything that could help us. At first, it felt like we were chasing shadows, until Luke pulled out an old plat map from the 1960s and froze. "Grandpa," he said slowly, tapping a section of the map with his finger. "Look at this." I leaned in, my eyes tracing the eastern property line where Maple Creek Estates now sat. But there, highlighted in faded blue ink, was something I didn't recognize, a separate parcel of land, just over 2 acres, that wasn't accounted for in any of my recent tax documents. I pulled out the most recent county GIS map for comparison, my heart beating faster with each second. That parcel wasn't marked as mine anymore, it was now listed under Maple Creek Estates HOA. But here's where Barbara and her developer friends had made their critical mistake. That land was never sold to them. Back in the 1960s, during a rough financial patch, my father had temporarily deeded that 2-acre section to my great-uncle, who later sold it back to the family in 1964. But because of the separate transaction history, it had a different deed number than the rest of the farm. When the developers purchased the land for Maple Creek Estates, they must have overlooked that separate deed entirely, which meant that their prized multi-million-dollar clubhouse, infinity pool, and one of their tennis courts were built on land that legally still belonged to me. I sat back in my chair, staring at the documents in front of me, my breath slow and measured. This wasn't some technical loophole, this was ironclad legal proof that they were trespassing. Luke exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "So, what do we do?" I smiled for the first time in days. "We let them know exactly where they stand." The next morning, I met with Walt Benson, our family's attorney, laying the documents across his desk. He read them carefully, adjusting his glasses, his expression shifting from curiosity to absolute astonishment. "Frank," he started, but I cut him off. "It's Hank, Walt." He grinned. "Well, Hank, you just hit the legal jackpot. This isn't just a minor boundary dispute, they built an entire luxury facility on your land. You have every right to demand removal or compensation." I nodded, already knowing what my next move had to be. "So let's give them a choice." Walt sat back, folding his hands. "They're gonna fight you." I met his gaze. "Then let's make sure they lose." By the time I left his office, Walt had already drafted the legal notice, demanding an emergency meeting with the HOA board. I wasn't asking, I was telling them that their clubhouse was illegally encroaching on my land and that they had 48 hours to negotiate a settlement before I started taking drastic action. Barbara had tried to destroy me. Now, I was going to make her watch as I took back what was mine. The HOA board sat around a polished mahogany table in their executive-style clubhouse, the very building they had no legal right to occupy. The air was thick with tension as I spread the certified survey maps across the table, letting them see the truth for themselves. Barbara Whitmore, her smug confidence cracking for the first time since this war began, stared at the documents with narrowed eyes. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, flipping through the papers like she could find some mistake. The developer assured us that all property lines were verified before construction. "They weren't," I said evenly, watching her squirm. "And now you've got a problem, Barbara. Your multi-million-dollar clubhouse, your infinity pool, and your precious tennis courts? They're sitting on my land." James Caldwell, the HOA vice president, leaned in, scanning the documents carefully. Unlike Barbara, he wasn't a fool. He could see the writing on the wall. This looks legitimate," he muttered. Barbara's head snapped toward him. "You're not seriously entertaining this nonsense, are you?" I didn't let her derail the conversation. I slid my list of demands across the table. "Here's what happens next. You compensate me for the destruction of my crops, $50,000 to cover lost revenue and soil remediation. You publicly apologize for your actions. You resign, effective immediately, and the HOA signs a new agreement that respects my farm's operations. Or, I let the word hang in the air like a storm cloud." "Or what?" Barbara scoffed. I leaned forward. "Or I bulldoze everything on my land." The room went dead silent. Barbara laughed, but it was forced now, her voice slightly higher than before. "You can't be serious." I pulled out one more document, the legal injunction my attorney had filed that morning, giving me the right to remove unauthorized structures on my land. I placed it in front of her like a loaded gun. "I'll give you 48 hours to decide," I said, standing up. "After that? I start digging." The HOA board descended into chaos. James was already arguing with Barbara, 2 other board members were whispering in the corner, and Barbara was clutching her pen like it was a knife, her face red with fury. But instead of a settlement offer, I got a certified letter from the HOA the next day. Barbara had convinced the board to fight me. The letter claimed my legal claims were fraudulent, accused me of making terroristic threats against community property, and warned that any attempt to remove the clubhouse would result in immediate legal action. I laughed when I read it. They were bluffing, and I called Walt Benson immediately. "They're stalling," Walt said, already making his way to the courthouse. But they just made a huge mistake. 3 days later, we had our day in court. Judge Harriet Michaels, a no-nonsense woman who grew up on a dairy farm herself, barely let Barbara's high-priced lawyer finish his opening statement before cutting him off. "Let me get this straight," she said, tapping the survey map with a pen. "You built a clubhouse on this man's land without his consent, and now you're arguing he can't do anything about it?" Barbara's lawyer tried every trick in the book: adverse possession, public necessity, community value, but the law was clear. "The encroachment is less than 15 years old," Judge Michaels said, adjusting her glasses. "And state law requires 20 years for an adverse possession claim. You don't have a case." Then, just to twist the knife, she added, "and public necessity? That applies to government entities, not private HOAs." Her ruling was uncompromising: I owned the land. The clubhouse was illegally built on my property. And if the HOA refused to negotiate, I had the right to tear it all down. Barbara was furious. She demanded an emergency HOA meeting that night, calling me a vindictive farmer trying to extort the community. She even announced a $20,000 per household emergency assessment to fight back against this fraud. That's when residents started calling me. Homeowners who had always stayed neutral were suddenly outraged when they saw the court ruling themselves. They weren't funding an HOA defense, they were paying for Barbara's personal war. Then came the final straw, the fake protest. That night, a crowd of people gathered outside my farm, holding signs that read, "Keep your hands off our clubhouse," and "Stop the extortion." But something felt off. The crowd was too organized, too rehearsed. And when Luke checked security footage, we caught Barbara paying a group of people to act as angry homeowners. By morning, the truth was all over social media. And by noon, Barbara Whitmore was finished. At 7 a.m. sharp, I climbed into my bulldozer, the engine rumbling beneath me like a storm on the horizon. The court order was in my pocket. The sheriff and my attorney, Walt Benson, stood at my side, ready to enforce it. The residents of Maple Creek Estates lined the sidewalks, watching in stunned silence. Some were furious, others curious, and a few, more than I expected, looked relieved. Barbara Whitmore stood at the clubhouse entrance, her blue HOA blazer pressed and perfect, but there was no hiding the panic in her eyes. She had lost control, and she knew it. I shifted the bulldozer into gear and lowered the blade toward the corner of the infinity pool, the same way she had crushed my crops under her Jeep. As the blade touched the concrete, cracks spiderwebbed outward, water gushing onto the pavement. That's when James Caldwell ran forward, waving his arms. "Stop. We accept your terms." I cut the engine, the sudden silence deafening. James turned to the crowd, his voice steady. "The HOA board held an emergency vote this morning. We have decided to accept Mr. Walker's settlement. Barbara has been removed from the board, effective immediately." The moment he spoke, 2 security guards stepped forward, escorting Barbara off the property. She screamed threats, promising lawsuits, vowing revenge, but no one listened. She climbed into her same red Jeep, the one that had flattened my crops, and peeled out of the neighborhood. That was the last time anyone in Maple Creek Estates saw her. The new HOA board, led by James and retired Judge Margaret Lawson, honored every term of my deal. I received $50,000 in damages, a formal apology, and a signed agreement protecting my farm. But the best part? They added their own provisions. A community farmers market in the clubhouse parking lot, featuring my produce. An annual Farm Heritage Day, where local kids could learn about agriculture. A bronze plaque at the neighborhood entrance, renaming their community park Walker Fields, in honor of my family's legacy. With Barbara gone, things actually got better. The same people who once saw my farm as a nuisance now volunteered during harvest season and bought produce directly from me. And Luke, my grandson, had the best realization of all. "You didn't just win a battle, Grandpa," he said. "You changed how they see us." And that's the thing about people like Barbara. They think power comes from rules, fines, and intimidation. But real power comes from standing your ground, no matter who tries to take what's yours. Have you ever felt powerless against an HOA or an entitled Karen? Share your story below, let's see who had it worse.